To our read aloud of Explorers, the story of the race to the moon. Last time we learned about the early history of outer space science. We learned about how rockets were developed, and we even learned that at the beginning of rocket development, they were actually used more as weapons than as ways to get into space, which is pretty scary. And then we saw kind of how the Soviet Union started the space race pretty hot. Like they got the first satellite in space. It's called Sputnik. It's this cool little sphere here on the screen on the left. And they got the first animal in space, the dog Laika. They got the first human in space, Yuri Gagarin. And they even got the first woman in space, although I don't think that one was on here. Let's keep going and see what's up with the rest of the space race. The race begins. It's funny, this book thinks the race is beginning after the Russians already got ahead. I'm not sure I agree. Gagarin's success embarrassed the United States. America's National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, had been formed in 1958. Its aim was to put a man in space. By 1961, NASA had sent a chimpanzee named Ham on a brief space flight, but while von Braun was perfecting the American rocket, news came of Gagarin's success. In May 1961, the new president, John F. Kennedy, vowed that America would place a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before 1970. The race was on. Americans in space. In 1961, the first American astronaut, Alan Shepard, entered space. It took until 1962 when John Glenn was the first American to orbit the Earth, completing 3 circuits before splashing down in the Atlantic. There's a picture of this cool R2D2 looking thing on the screen. That thing is called Telstar, and it's a satellite that the U.S. launched in 1962. And launch, if you don't know, is a word that means just to send up or to push out into space. Sometimes we use launch to talk about the start of something, the start of a program, but the main meaning is to shoot something out from a spot. Following this President's speech in 1961, the moon landing project, codenamed Apollo, was given massive funding. So they started putting money into this project called Apollo, which would take people to the moon. At the bottom here it says, the first woman in space. In 1963, the Soviets pressed forward again. Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman in space. She spent almost 3 days in space, completing 48 orbits. Wow, that sounds like, I don't know, maybe kind of a bummer, a little bit difficult. But it's awesome that she did that, and she is a hero, the first woman in space. Voskhod 1. In 1964, the Soviets launched Voskhod 1, which is the word for sunrise, carrying 3 cosmonauts in a cabin filled with air, so there was no need for spacesuits. Wow, that sounds a little dangerous, but okay, cool. In June 1965, American astronaut Edward White walked in space, maneuvering with gas jets from a handheld gun. Oh, cool. Spacewalks. In 1965, Russian cosmonaut Alexei Leonov took the first walk in space, putting the Soviets ahead again. The trip was not trouble-free. Leonov struggled to re-enter his craft because his spacesuit made it difficult for him to bend enough to fit back through the hatch. On re-entry, his craft landed off course. The crew spent a night surrounded by wolves before rescue came. Wow, that's a pretty cool story, actually. Oh, here we go. America catches up. So by the early 1960s, America and the Soviet Union were racing one another to the moon. The Apollo spaceship, designed by the Americans, consisted of 2 craft which would fly together but also operate separately. A command ship and a moonlander. So on this screen, the command ship is actually pictured. It's over here. The moonlander is not shown on the screen yet. But the Apollo missions had both had a command mission that would stay up above the moon and then something that would go down to the moon. The moonlander would visit the moon and then rejoin the main ship for the trip back to Earth. A new rocket would be needed to carry the craft into space, but there were questions about the moon itself. Was the surface suitable for landing? Or was it covered with a layer of dust which a spacecraft would sink into? Both countries sent unmanned craft called probes to investigate. Here's the American probe, Surveyor 3, landing on the move to check. Is this thing just covered in dust and you can't land on it, or is it cool? Docking in space. During 1965 to 1969, American astronauts practiced for the moon mission in Gemini craft. 2 Apollo craft would need to meet and dock, or join, in space. So in 1965, Geminis 5 and 6 flew within meters of each other to check and see if you could do that. In December 1968, Apollo 8 lifted off. On board, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders were the first men to leave Earth's orbit and start traveling to the moon. On Christmas Eve, they became the first astronauts to see the far side of the moon. The crew spent 20 hours orbiting the moon before returning safely to Earth. Wow, that must have been a very lonely Christmas Eve. Just you and 2 other guys out here on the very, very far side of the moon. If you got to read Margaret and the Moon with me the other day, you might remember that the moon is over 235,000 miles away from the Earth. And that's a really, really long distance. On the moon's far side, the crew of the Apollo 8 lost contact with NASA when the bulk of the moon blocked out radio signals. Everyone at Mission Control Center in Houston, Texas, waited anxiously for the ship to clear the far side and reestablish contact. The mission went without a hitch and returned safely. Distant world. The moon is 238,855 miles from Earth. It took Apollo 8 3 days to reach it, traveling at a top speed of 23,860 miles per hour. We'll read more about Destination the Moon.